This is going to be a very consequential week for the Russia-Ukraine war, as the Munich Security Conference is set to begin on the 14th of this month, which I believe is Thursday. And many senior American officials are planning on going. And one of the hottest topics on this whole front is ending the Russia-Ukraine war. What is the President Trump going to do? What does Zelensky want to do? And what will President Putin do? All those things are going to be taken for center stage. And we have a great guest to try and help us untangle some of this today, because a lot of differences going on. It's Colonel Jacques Baud, retired former Swiss strategic intelligence officer and NATO officer as well. Colonel, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me back in the show. Thank you.
Well, listen, this is going to be a very consequential week. A lot of people in Europe especially are going to be gathering in Munich to try and see what the latest is on the whole bringing the war to negotiated end. Just what are you hearing from the ground there in Europe in terms of what people in Europe are thinking?
Well, I think we see more and more, in fact, a divided West about the situation. And 2 years ago, it was a kind of a Western gung-ho against Russia. And today we see more and more realistic approach to the problem. I mean, even if everybody remains vehemently against Russia, there is a movement of kind of rationality, because apparently the Trump administration is ready to abandon the conflict. I mean, that's what Trump promised, and he is apparently determined to do that. And that the consequence is that the whole problem will come to the Europeans. And in fact, that's exactly what Waltz just said in an interview to NBC, where he says basically we give the baby back to the European. Now they have to sort out the solutions. And
let me ask you that, because that's a little odd to me, frankly. And I've seen Keir Starmer and Mark Rutte both just less than a week ago. I think it was exactly a week ago. We're still saying that there's going to be continued support, that the UK said we're going to give more in 2025 than we have in any other year of the war. Mark Rutte said we're still going to keep going on. And yet all of this in the shadows of Trump moving closer to saying, I'm going to have this thing wrapped up in 100 days if I can. How do those two things simultaneously work together in Europe?
Well, the problem is what the German used to call realpolitik, so the real politics, because at the end of the day, it's well and nice to say we'll continue to fund the conflict, but we know that up to now, all the US, in fact, funded the conflict. The Europeans participated, they contributed with some donation of equipment and things like that. But the core of the support to Ukraine was provided by the US. And if the same amount of support should be now covered by Europeans, I'm not sure they can afford it, simply. I mean, even Keir Starmer, he can claim whatever he wants, but again, I'm not familiar with the budgetary situation of the UK. But right. If I look at what you have in France, for instance, and Germany, which are the largest economies in Europe, because remember that when we talk about Europe, we are talking about, in fact, two Europes. We are talking about the old Europe, Germany, France, Italy, and those who pay for Europe. These are the net donors in the European Union. And you have the new Europe, as Donald Rumsfeld called it, which basically are the Eastern countries. And these Eastern countries, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, these are the net recipients of the fees or what the European Union has as money. Meaning that when we talk about Europe, we have two different views. We obviously have the Baltic state, the new Europe, that is vehemently against Russia and claims that we have to continue the support to Ukraine and all that, which is nice and fine. But these guys are not those who pay. They are those who receive the money. Now, those who pay, and as I said, these are the largest economy of Europe, I'm not sure they can afford it, because all of them, I mean, if I talk about Germany, France, Belgium, Italy, they all have their budgetary crisis now. So where do they will get the money, and the same amount of money that was provided by the US so far to Ukraine? I think I'm not sure. There is a point where probably Europeans have to go a little bit beyond wishful thinking. And
Well, I would suggest that we probably reached that point a long time ago, but it doesn't seem to. I think it was also this past week where, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the UK announced that they were going to pick up the mantle of leadership on the so-called Ramstein meeting, which the Biden administration had been running, and nobody in the Trump team had even been talking about continuing it forward. But then you talk about leadership. So the United States was providing not just the financial leadership, but also the diplomatic heft, I guess, to make that happen. Do you think that the UK can lead a substantive new Ramstein format for Ukraine going forward?
well, the Ramstein gathering, yeah, we have to remember that these are about 57 nations or so. So it's NATO plus other nations such as Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, and so on and so forth. And essentially, the Ramstein group is a donor club, so to say. So it happened that it was on the Ramstein base because of the logistics and all that, and it was more convenient to have that in Germany. But US was leading this group because it was the largest donor, and it was almost obvious, it made sense in fact to have the US to make this kind of coordination. In addition to that, they have the assets and the resources to manage this kind of resources. And of course, when we talk about resources, we're talking about the whole supply line that goes from Australia to the battlefield or US and so on and so forth. So meaning that requires a lot of logistical assets, and the US were best to coordinate that. UK can probably do that technically, but they will not have the same kind of leadership, because the US, obviously, as the largest donor, had the kind of legitimacy to do that. I'm not sure that the UK would have the legitimacy to do that as well. And in addition to that, we are in a more confused time, because, as I said before, a lot of countries are today questioning the purpose of the support to Ukraine. And we see that very much in France. We see that in Germany. And that will certainly be amplified by the upcoming elections that you will have in Germany. And in France, it's not completely settled, but you have a crisis that may lead to some change in the parliament and in the government as well. So I'm not sure that UK will have an easy job in leading this whole coordination.
Well, I might go so far as to say it's an impossible task, because I mean, just imagine if we were saying, okay, the United States is just going to step aside from the Ramstein format and the leadership, et cetera, and here, UK, you pick up the mantle. It would be challenging, but maybe doable. It depends on how they work, because they'll have a lot less heft when it comes to cajoling anybody else to give certain stuff like the previous administration did, because that was the priority of the United States. Instead, you have the opposite. Here's what President Trump said from Air Force One just yesterday.
You realize if you don't clarify that, everyone's going to assume you're talking to to President Putin regularly?
Well, they can assume it.
So is it
It
safe
makes
to-
sense. Well, I don't want to talk about it. And if we are talking, I don't want to tell you about the conversations too early. But I do believe we're making progress. We want to stop the Ukraine-Russia war. And I want to stop it just because I hate to see all these young people being killed. The soldiers are being killed by the hundreds of thousands.
So you're starting to put together a plan for like a peace formula or for some sort of resolution?
We're talking to both sides. And I would imagine I would be meeting with Putin, yes, at the right time. I think at the right time, at the appropriate time.
And at least historically, when a president would say something like that, that at the right time meet with Putin means that once all of the subordinate leaders have gotten something close to a negotiated settlement or agreement on whatever, and then the two leaders would come together to finalize agreements and then make an announcements or so. But that tells you that very feverishly behind the scenes, apparently, both the United States and Russia are working hard on finding an end to this conflict. And for his part, Putin has said also that he's perfectly happy to talk. But I thought it was interesting, and I'd like if you think this means anything or not, that Trump has been focusing a lot on the human cost and the casualties. He's on both sides, but Putin has also said that one of the reasons he wants the war to come to an end is because of the humanitarian cost, both to the soldiers on the ground as well as civilians. Do you see anything interesting in there, both citing that as being why they want to bring this to an end?
Well, I think on the Russian side, it has always been the position. I mean, the Russians always said they are ready to talk, and they have demonstrated that on 3 occasions. I remind you that one day after the start of the special military operation, that means on the 25th of February 2022, Zelensky called the Swiss Minister of Foreign Affairs to organize a peace conference. The peace conference didn't happen, but you had a first round of talks that happened at the Belarus border that started right on the 26th or 27th of February 2022. And the Russians were ready to do so. And eventually the Europeans asked Zelensky to stop that. And Zelensky, because he noticed that the whole thing was probably not going in the right direction, he resumed some talks, and that were the talks that happened in Istanbul. And the Russians participated in that, and that was more or less constructive until Boris Johnson came and stopped the whole thing again. And you had a third occasion that is very rarely mentioned, that came in August 2022, when Erdogan visited the Ukraine, and he proposed a summit between Zelensky and Putin. And Zelensky agreed to do that. Putin was not very enthusiastic, but apparently after some discussion, he declared himself ready to have this summit. And then Boris Johnson came again, and that was end of August 2022. That was 1 week later, or something like that. It was something like the 20th of August. And Boris Johnson came again and said it was not the time for flimsy agreement or flimsy talks or something like this.
And what around that time, isn't that also somewhere around August? Isn't that when Ukraine launched its a surprise move in the Kharkiv area?
That came just after. The operation came just a few that, and in fact, so that was end of August 2022, what the talks. And then in September 2022, you had this advance in the Kharkov area, which was anticipated by the Russians. They left the region days before the Ukrainians were coming, and we know because you had huge ammunition depots in the region of Balaklaya, and these huge depots that would require days to be emptied. They were emptied in good order by the Russians day before. So when the Ukrainians came in, everything was empty and the Russians had abandoned. And if you read my book on Operation Z, I explain why. Because in the region of Kharkov and in the region of Kherson that was left by the Russians just 1 month later in October,
Yep.
the Russians had almost no military presence. They were not prepared to fight in this region. That was totally secondary for them. So they preferred to withdraw their troops, to wait for the Ukrainians, and to welcome them with intense artillery fire. And the Ukrainians lost a lot of troops in Kharkov. And the Russians had no losses at all, because in fact, the Ukrainians came into a fire killing zone. In fact, that's what happened. And but after September, and that's this early success or apparent success of the Ukrainians in September 2022, Zelensky adopted his or he promulgated his decree, and the decree was discussed in the National Security Council of Ukraine on the 30th, or agreed by the Security Council on the 30th of September. So just after, because then Zelensky was kind of reshuffled by the success of the Kharkov offensive, and he decided that from that point there is no need to talk with the Russians. And you had just a few weeks later, you had the Kherson episode that was in fact very similar to what happened in Kharkov. The Russians withdrew well before the Ukrainians would come, but it gave to the Ukrainians and to the West at large, it gave the sense that there was a capacity of the Ukrainians to advance and to regain territory.
Right. But I think that's exactly what I was about to ask you, because there was definitely a lot of public enthusiasm, and even among many military journals here in the United States, that they were saying, this is now two big, huge losses for the Russians. Now the Ukraine needs to keep pressing it on, start this offensive in 2023. But there was one voice in November, I think you and I have talked about this before, in November of 2022, where Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, very publicly came out and says, if you ever wanted a negotiated settlement from a position of strength, now is your time. So I've always interpreted that to mean that he is well aware that those successes were temporary and had caveats, and that Russia was in the process of ramping up, and he knew that time was not going to be good to the Ukraine. I wonder if you have any knowledge about what conversations may have been going on in Europe around that time. Did they or did they not recognize the reality of what those victories for Ukraine meant?
No, the problem of the West, and that's still the case, especially in Europe, a little bit less in the US because of the new approach that the Trump administration has. But in Europe, it's still the same thing. We tend to believe in the narrative we have created. And that's the problem, because instead of looking at the reality on the ground, we rely on the narrative we created. And that's exactly what happened then. The whole issue, if you may remember that in October 2022, as the Ukrainians were to enter the Kherson region, Zelensky said to his troops, don't go too fast. Don't go there too fast, because it might be a trap set by the Russians. Because he had the previous experience of what happened in Kharkov. So the Russians withdrew and just waited the Ukrainians in killing zone, literally. And for that reason, the serious experts assessed that it was not a real success for the Ukrainians. It could be sold as a success, but it was, militarily speaking, it was not a success. But of course, Zelensky is a politician, And the problem, and that's the difference between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Russians conduct the war from the general staff. I mean, it's a military conduct of the war. It's not Putin that conducts the war. It's the military. While if you go on the Ukrainian side, it is Zelensky. And Zelensky, of course, he has not the view of a military, but the view of a politician. That's the reason why for him, the narrative, the rhetoric is so important. And that's the reason why, in fact, Zelensky tried to exploit this apparent success in Kharkov and in Kherson to show the West that his forces were able to lead a serious counteroffensive against the Russians, and hence from that point you had all this narrative of the future counteroffensive that eventually was launched in June 2023.
Yeah,
but
to much fanfare and failure. But so now then here we are with all of that history. Now then here we are on the current situation. As you mentioned, there has been a change of administration. So there's been a dramatic alteration in where the United States plans on leading. And we mentioned that Trump showed right there he's not only ready, but has already been talking to Putin. Apparently somewhat before that, in December, after Trump had been elected, but apparently before they had talked, Putin was asked, are you going to talk to Trump? Are you willing to have negotiations? And he said, yes, of course. But he added a couple of interesting caveats, which may have something to do with where negotiations are going now.
We're also open for dialogue with the new US administration on the Ukrainian conflict. The most important thing here is to eliminate the fundamental reason for the conflict. That's the most important. And as for settling the situation itself, its goal should be not a brief ceasefire, not just getting some time to regroup and rearm and carry on the conflict, but a long-term peace based on respect to lawful interests of all people and nationalities living in the region.
So that's interesting what he says there. We're not looking for any kind of a ceasefire because that's one of the things that the Kellogg plan has claimed to be looking for is a ceasefire, something like the Korean scenario where they'll have an east and a west in this case instead of a north and a south, but like a demilitarized zone. And you've even had Zelensky saying, hey, how's about 200,000 peacekeepers going to go ahead and knock on that? But you have the Putin there leading with, yeah, we're looking for a way to end this war, not to just freeze it on the current line of contact. What does that tell you about where the Russians are?
Well, in fact, the Russians have been constant on that. I mean, if you read what Vladimir Putin said on the 14th of June at the foreign ministry, to the foreign ministry officials, he said exactly the same thing. He said, there will be no ceasefire. There will be a solution. We want a definitive solution.
Well, in fact, actually, we have that handy. But before you finish on, let me show, in case anybody didn't see that, here's what he said on 14 June of last summer.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
And we had, in case anybody's thinking, well, that was last June. Well, we had Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, today, literally hours ago before we came on the air today, said, listen, the West needs to understand that all of Putin's June 14th conditions will have to be met. So he's not even talking anything about any compromise on any of those points. Big question, do you think Russia can do that, or is this just a tough negotiating position from which they'll negotiate away from later?
Well, the thing is that if you read the text that we just heard from Vladimir Putin in June last year, if you read the full text, you will see that, in fact, the two basic conditions, which are essentially the four regions, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk, free from Ukrainian troops, point one. The second is the non-participation to NATO. These are not just what the Russians want to achieve. These are the precondition to enter into the negotiation, meaning that this is simply the baseline. Everything that come on top of that can be discussed probably, but not this. This is just the first, the initial step to enter the negotiation. That's why the Russians will not change their mind on that. They have said that. They've been consistent since the very beginning. I mean, if you just mentioned, we just heard Vladimir Putin mentioning its objectives. And if you compare what he said to what he said on the very first day of the military operation, that means on the 24th of February 2022, he set exactly the same objectives: demilitarization and denazification, with a priority on the protection of the population of Donbass, the Russian population of Ukraine, basically.
So now let me ask you, because I think that's really important. What do you? A lot of people are saying, okay, yeah, I get it. The June 14th lines, the four oblasts, and the non-aligned status, non-nuclear status. Okay, they get that, and most in the West will stop right there. But the last two things you said on there, which you just iterated here, I think are really important, because I think that they're potentially profoundly different. The denazification and demilitarization, he added. What does that mean in your view? What does Russia mean in terms of what they think the end state will look like?
Well, they have defined that extremely clearly. Demilitarization and we have to remember that the reason why the operation was started, and I repeat my word, I'm very careful here. The reason why the operation started is to protect the population of the Donbass against a military threat and the threat of the paramilitaries, which are considered as neo-Nazi by the Russians. And the two words, demilitarization and denazification, which were in fact taken by Vladimir Putin from the Potsdam Declaration of 1945, those two, there were four Ds in Potsdam in 1945, namely demilitarization, denazification, democratization, and decentralization. These were the four Ds. Two of them have been taken, or let's say, yes, taken over by Putin to express the objectives: demilitarization and denazification. And why is that important? We hear quite a lot that the reason for this operation, or the Russian military operation, is because of NATO. And it's true if we consider that strategically. But this is not the formal reason why the Russians attacked. And in fact, it would not be legal to attack a country just because he wants to be member of NATO. This would not be legal. And if we look at how the Russians prepared the legal context of their offensive, you can see that it is extremely precise. And the reason why they entered, it's to implement the so-called responsibility to protect, which is a principle of the United Nations. And that's why it's very important. And that's why also the Western countries, or the Western narrative, better said, never mentions the the offensive that was being prepared by the Ukrainians against the Donbass.
Right.
That's a key point, because that gives the legitimacy for the Russians to invoke the responsibility to protect, and therefore have a legal legitimacy, a legality to help the population of Donbass. And that's the reason why. So it's extremely both complex and very subtle.
Okay, but so what does that mean then when in terms of negotiations? So let's say that maybe not Trump and Putin together, or they could perhaps be on the phone when they're just talking. What it's clear what the first part will be, where the lines are, because Putin articulated them in June last summer, so we know where the lines that Putin wants are. But then there's the issue of the denazification, demilitarization. What will Putin tell Trump that he would have to agree to in negotiations to get the war to come to an end? That's the hard part.
Well, these are the objectives, and we have to also understand the Russian mind and the way they conceive and design operations. In essence, the Russians try to achieve tactical success and to convert them into operational success. When they have an operational success, they try to convert it in a strategic success, meaning that the word demilitarization that was clearly explained in February 2022 by Vladimir Putin as the demilitarization of the threat against the population of Donbass today is converted into something strategic, which is the demilitarization of Ukraine. It is an incremental process that you can see constantly, that you also see in World War II by the Soviets. It's the strict application of the Clausewitzian principle that when you achieve a success, you don't stop to the tactical value of your success. You want to have a success that has a value to achieve a higher objective. You don't attack things for the sake of attacking things. You don't have an objective you don't achieve a success for the sake of having a success. You want to be able to use this success for a higher objective, and that's exactly what Vladimir Putin is doing, and that's the rationale behind you can still use the word demilitarization and denazification, although interestingly enough, after Mariupol was encircled by the Russian forces in March 2022, and namely on the 28th of March 2022, the command of the Russian forces said that the objective of denazification was reached, in essence. The problem is that since then, you still have paramilitaries, you still have those guys in volunteers and all that who still have this kind of ultra-nationalist and neo-Nazi. I mean, you can call, although the official word used by Vladimir Putin is always neo-Nazi, not Nazi. That's very also important. But anyway, that's a detail.
So would he ask Trump to say, okay, I want to literally physically disarm all of the militia
exactly
that are fighting?
Yeah, the militia, it want to destroy the potential of disturbance that provided by the Ukrainian military system, if you want. Not simply the military forces, but also the paramilitary forces. You have to understand that beyond the simple military forces in Ukraine, you also have those paramilitary forces that are still active in Ukraine. You even have armies like the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, which is not part of the armed forces, but works together with the armed forces. So it's a very complex system. But these are right-wing extremists, and that means that for the Russians, the fight they are conducting in Ukraine is not simply against the official military forces of Ukraine, but against the whole setting of paramilitary forces that have been armed, equipped by the West trained by the West, trained by the UK, for instance, Canada, and so on. So they want to destroy this potential.
That sets up the United States and the West for, as I see it here, a real dilemma, because what it sounds to me like is that Russia will either is setting themselves up for a situation. You tell me if you think I'm wrong here, that they'll say they're either going to accomplish their strategic objectives, which you just outlined there, the demilitarization, denazification, and the June 14th administrative lines, by negotiations with Trump, which they're apparently willing to do, or that they'll seize them and accomplish them by military force. Now, many in the West say that's not really possible. You know, look how long it took Russia to get up to this point here, 3 years, and they still barely have 20-something%. They made progress in 2024, but, it wasn't huge progress, and there's still a long way to go even to get to the Dnieper River. But here's some interesting things. I'm going to remind people of what you talked about the last time you were on our show, that there is the potential for an actual uprising on the Ukraine side of the border in the east. That's one major thing, which I've still not seen anywhere else in the West. But then Zelensky himself eliminated another potential, very conventional threat.
Yeah, well, it's important. I mean,
we're supposed to play a video right there. The one.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Gary. The one about the Russian divisions.
Знаємо, наша розвідка нам доповідає, що росіяни створюють нові дивізії, нові військові виробництва розвивають. Очевидно, буде і надалі розширюватись їхня співпраця з Північною Кореєю. На жаль, сучасні технології війни Москва розповсюджує ще у той регіон, зокрема, дронові технології. І це означає просту річ. Путін готується зовсім не до перемовин, не до настання миру, а до продовження війни. І не тільки проти нас, проти України. Всі партнери повинні про це знати і повинні це бачити. Відповідну інформацію ми готові передавати, і по лінії розвідок вже відбувається відповідна комунікація. Ми повинні разом бачити, які є загрози, які є наші інструменти протидії. Потрібне чітке розуміння тут, в Європі, кожній країні доведеться зміцнювати оборону.
So he was a little bit wordy there, but when you look at some of the other things he said in context of that, he's basically saying there is, and later he quantified it, a 100,000 additional Russian forces that are outfitted with armor and drones and all kinds of other technology not engaged in conflict right now, meaning that somewhere behind the current lines, which are still moving to the west, Russia could punch through a very large formation that it's unclear that Ukraine can manage. So when you look at those two things together, what could be on the Ukraine side of the eastern part of their country and what could be on the Russian side of that line with a large formation on top of what they already have, is it plausible that Russia could seize all the territory that they want and physically denazify and demilitarize Ukraine?
Well, I don't know if Russia is willing or even prepared to seize a larger part of Ukraine. It's a possible scenario, but we have to be careful here. When Vladimir Putin says that his objective is to destroy or to demilitarize and denazify, he's talking about destroying a potential. He's not talking about taking territories. When we discuss the war, and even on all those channels that discuss the war, we tend to measure success in the number of square meters or kilometers that have been seized by the Russians. But in reality, if the objective is to destroy a potential, not to take territory, we should measure the success in the number of casualties taken by the Ukrainians, in fact. And this is a figure that we don't have. And that's the reason why, by the way, we have a lot of confusion that is created, in fact, in the West or by Ukraine, because Ukraine doesn't make public any of its casualties. I mean, the Russians don't either. But in fact, the only way to measure the success of a Russian based on the objective they have, because at the end of the day, your objective is determined by the kind of objective you have. When you say, for instance, as Milley used to say, that the objective of the Russians was to take Kiev in 3 days, and then they say, well, they didn't achieve that, so they failed. Well, but that's an objective that the Russians have never said. This is an objective that was completely created in the West. It was created with in a specific purpose, that was to say that the Russians were not effective. But the Russians have never set such an objective. Their objective is to destroy a potential. And what we see today, every day, by the way, I mean, the Ukrainians deserting, the forced recruitment, the lack of personnel, everything that Zelensky is asking the West to provide, all that demonstrates that the Russians are extremely effective. And in fact, if we look at what Zelensky asked for, we can say that the Russians achieved their objective at least 3 times, because in May-June 2022, Zelensky himself said that from that point onwards, he relied on the Western support. That means that the army he had in March or February, end of February, was in fact destroyed in May, June 2022. And from that point on, we started to see this former East or communist era material coming from Eastern countries and pouring into Ukraine, the old T-22, the old T-62, the even T-55 improved from the Czech, and so on and so forth. And this was destroyed at the end of 2022. And that's the point where Zelensky started to ask for Abrams tank, Leopard 2, and all that, because everything he received between June and December had been destroyed again. So we are now in this new phase since early 23, where the Ukrainian, and if you look at what's happening in Kursk and so on, you will see that it's all Western equipment. You don't see a former communist equipment anymore, because this is the new, and since, I would say, since the Kursk offensive last year, you don't even see tank anymore. You just see like MRAP vehicles and structures and things like this,
etc.
Because it has been destroyed. So meaning that the Russians are slowly achieving their objectives, even if you don't see that on the map. And that's why the Russians are so confident, because they know that even if they don't advance, and they will probably do that in Pokrovsk and so on, we have discussed that many times, they will certainly continue to proceed on the terrain. But it's not their objective. Their objective is to destroy the potential. And the fact that Zelensky push its units to hang on the territory, to stay on, to defend every square meter. In fact, he's working towards for the Russians to some extent.
So let me ask you, and with all of that said, here in the last few minutes we have, where is that going to leave Trump? Trump's going to come in and thinking he's going to want to maybe settle for, he's going to want to settle for something that's close to the current line of contact, which apparently Putin has ruled out. And he's going to want a ceasefire, and he's going to want like armed neutrality for Ukraine, et cetera. And so far as I can see, Russia's going to say no to all those things. So if that's the two entry levels when they're talking, what is that going to mean on the ground? What will the Russians do, and how long might it take?
Well, it's a good question, but you could have had exactly the same question in April 2022, because basically that's what they achieved in the agreement, meaning that the only problem is how do we monitor that, because the Russians have absolutely no trust vis-a-vis the West. They know that the West will take any opportunity to rearm us. So that's the reason why for the Russians it's important to destroy all the potential, because at the end of the day, and some experts have said that at the end of the day, the problem for Ukraine is that they will not have personnel anymore. Even if you have an agreement now, who they will arm, because you will have no army anymore. And a lot of people have emigrated to Europe, and apparently these guys have absolutely no intent to go back to Ukraine. Ukraine will be totally destroyed, and nobody is apparently willing to really fund the reconstruction. I mean, that's exactly what Mike Waltz just said. He said, well, we are not going to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine. That's for the Europeans, but the Europeans have no money for that, meaning that in fact the Russians will achieve this kind of demilitarization. They will destroy this potential. And the problem is that since the West didn't want to recognize the real objectives of the Russians, in fact they led Ukraine on the path of self-destruction.
And the last question I have for you here, in terms of how long this can last, if Russia does what it did in April 2022, they didn't get the deal they wanted, so they just continued to fight. So one would say they would probably continue to do that. But here's this isn't 2022 anymore, and apparently General Ryabkov, I'm sorry, yeah, I think it was the SBU general in Ukraine, admitted on air that if the war continued on like it was, they might not be able to continue having a viable military 6 months from now. They may just collapse. How do you see that?
Yes, I think it was Narishkin or the or Patrushev, I don't remember, but in any way, yes, I think that's exactly what will happen. The problem is that you have on the one hand, you have what the Russians are achieving on the ground, meaning the destruction of the military potential. But in addition to that, you have two things in Ukraine itself. First of all, you have what is at this stage not very much predictable, but it's an obvious force that is emerging, the partisan warfare that we have discussed last time. This is certainly one aspect. But there is also another aspect, that the population is tired of this conflict.
Yep.
Because they are suffering from this conflict, and they want to stop. And if you look the polls that the Kiev Institute for Sociology has recently published, you can see that you have less and less people in Ukraine that is willing to continue the war. And more or less today, you have about 50% of the population in of the western part. I mean, the population which is under Kiev control, that is ready to accept to abandon the territories in the east and the south to the Russians in exchange for peace, meaning that the Russians are achieving their objective. And if they achieve that, and if you have a treaty that sets a clear situation that Ukraine can be allowed a certain size for the armed forces, certain conditions, no participation to a military alliance, and nota bene, this was already in the Ukrainian constitution of 1991.
Right.
So the idea that there were no foreign troops on Ukrainian territory, no nuclear weapons, that the word neutrality was not used on that constitution, but there was a clear idea that there were no membership of Ukraine to any kind of a military alliance. So meaning that, in fact, what Russia is asking for is simply a return to this constitution of 1991, meaning that it's not completely unacceptable for the Ukrainians. It's just unacceptable for the Europeans, but not for the
Right.
Ukrainians. You see what I mean?
I do, yeah, and we'll find out how this is going to play out, because apparently we're getting closer to the, I guess, where it finally finds out the rubber meets the road, and we'll see what is going to be determined. Or is it going to be a negotiated settlement, or is it just going to be a longer war until the attrition plays its final role and there's a collapse? I mean, I think it's probably going to be one of those other ones there, but we'll wait and see how that happens. But thank you so much for coming on today. As always, it's an absolute delight to have you on.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much too. And also to let you guys know, I mentioned before that I had been interviewed by Tucker Carlson, did we recorded, sorry, couldn't get the word out, a show of, I guess, several weeks ago. Finally has hit the market there. It's on there. The link to this show is in the description here. If you want to go check out what I told Tucker Carlson, you can see that there. In the meantime, we appreciate you guys coming. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that yet. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.